Hello, my name is Tamar Harris, and today I'll be talking about how we can best communicate about suicide. My research question is, how should the media and professionals communicate about suicide events? And my hypothesis is that we should fight suicide stigma by avoiding secrecy, by talking openly. A lot of my presentation is not about preventing suicide. It's more about how do we talk to those who are affected by suicide. And those who are affected can be those who are simply exposed, have any connection to the deceased, even as a witness or watching it in the media. The suicide affected are those who feel a reaction after the suicide, and then there are those who are bereaved short-term and long-term. The statistics are quite astounding because a very large survey of adults in the US done by Feigelman found that 35% of adults in the US were emotionally distressed to any extent by a suicide in their lifetime. A third of us will be emotionally distressed by a suicide at some point in our life. And half of us will personally know someone who died by suicide. This is a very, very large prevalence of suicide. And despite all that, there is still secrecy, stigma, and taboos around suicide. A taboo is a very strong prohibition, and suicide has been a taboo to the extent that sometimes people can't be buried in the right cemetery if they are suicides. So people who attempt or complete a suicide are stigmatized. Even thinking of suicide is stigmatized, and being affected or bereaved is stigmatizing. There is also a cycle where, because it is a taboo and there is stigma, people talk about it less. And since people keep it secret, then there is more stigma. I read 3 studies, surveys of people who are bereaved by suicide. And these studies aim to find how much stigma they felt and the effect of the stigma on them. The results were very similar. These studies were in 3 different countries, 150 to 240 respondents. And each study found similar findings, that all of these people feel stigma, the suicide bereaved, and that stigma causes problems such as social awkwardness, worse mental health outcomes, more intense depression. I also read 2 literature reviews, basically studies of studies, and they made generalizations based on the studies that they reviewed. They found that stigma causes shame, blame, and avoidance, which leads to social withdrawal, reduced psychological and physical functioning, and difficult grief. Tal Young found similarly that suicide survivors are at higher risk of major depression, PTSD, suicidality, and complicated grief. So they put it in an interesting way. They said suicide survivors, those who lost a loved one to suicide, not only have the grief that they lost a loved one, but they have a substantial stigma in addition. So we definitely don't want to add more suffering to the people who are already mourning the ones they lost to suicide. And so this leads me to think that we could reduce the harmful stigma by reducing secrecy, by talking openly, which is basically my hypothesis. We could learn from Mr. Rogers, who said, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. In other words, if we mention suicide, if we talk about it openly, it'll be easier to manage for all of us, especially for those who are suicide bereaved. However, exposure to suicide, which includes talking about it, can cause more suicide thinking and acting. There's a well-known connection between media exposure and suicide. There's a contagion effect. For example, there was a contagion effect when teens watched the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why, which graphically depicts a suicide, and there was an immediate increase in suicides among teens and very young adults in the US. Walling has found that after wide publication of suicide details, it becomes an instigating factor in future suicide attempts, sort of like a catalyst. David Phillips studied publication of suicides in the UK for 20 years and found that there's an increase in suicides immediately after highly publicized suicides. Celebrity suicides are definitely an instigator, a catalyst. Data from 150 studies was collected and found that celebrity studies lead to more suicides, and especially to more suicides by the same method that the suicide used. This just gives us an idea of what a huge increase in suicides, just one death of one celebrity can cause when it is published widely in the media. After Robin Williams died, 10% increase in suicides in the US. Marilyn Monroe in 1962, 12% increase. Walling has a two-factor model of suicide. One is the predisposition factors, which is basically who we are. Do we have a psychosis, major depression, bipolar, epilepsy, trauma, substance abuse? And then there is the catalyst, the precipitating factors, an extremely stressful life event, or the way that society communicates about suicide, normalization, exposure in art and fiction, and in the media. I'm going to talk about these three communication issues. Just to remember, predisposition is like the dry wood, and precipitation is like the lit match on the dry wood. Together, they lead to suicide. So turning to communication about suicide, normalization and exposure. Let's talk about normalization. Exley studied normalization and its correlation to suicide ideation, suicide literacy, and mood. They asked their participant questions like, how much do you agree with this statement? Everyone has the right to commit suicide. And that was a way to measure normalization. They found that there is a correlation between suicide normalization and current suicidality, even after controlling for confounding variables. In other words, the more you consider suicide normal and an acceptable option, the more likely you are to be thinking or acting on suicide. And they believe that suicide normalization may reduce the barrier to considering suicide, and that this should be taken into consideration when creating policies. So we have discussed normalization, which is the belief that suicide is an acceptable option, and how exposure in films such as 13 Reasons Why and in the media can all increase suicide. Now, the question, of course, is how can we reduce these things? So harmful communication, media exposure, which leads to contagion. This includes media reports of nearby suicides and celebrity suicides. Stigma, which is correlated with worse mental health problems, secrecy, and more suicide ideation and activity. And normalization, which is believing that suicide is acceptable, correlated with more suicide thoughts and behavior. According to Exley, suicide stigma and suicide normalization are inversely correlated, suggesting that interventions to reduce public suicide stigma could unintentionally increase suicide normalization. So we are really in a bind if we are to believe Exley, because we want to reduce stigma and we want to reduce normalization because both are harmful, both lead to worse outcomes and more suicide ideation and activity. We want to reduce both, but they are inversely correlated, so that reducing one could unintentionally increase the other. So this really leads us to a big problem, which I phrased here. How can we prevent contagion and normalization while also avoiding harmful secrecy and stigma? How do we get around this problem that Exley identified? So a very basic, balanced approach that I am thinking about here is to fight the problem of media exposure and suicide contagion. We have to be very careful about how we report suicide. We have to be careful not to hide or stigmatize it. But at the same time, we must avoid sensationalizing the suicide, providing a lot of graphic detail. So reporting judiciously. We want to fight stigma and secrecy. We want to fight taboos, but at the same time, we must maintain an attitude that suicide is not acceptable. We have to be careful not to normalize it. And when we fight normalization, we do maintain the attitude that suicide is not acceptable, but we must accept the people who are affected by it, not make them feel stigmatized. This one leads me to think a little bit about what the Christians say, which is hate the sin, love the sinner. So hate the sin of suicide, but accept and love the people who are affected by it. So that's really what I have, and here are my references. Thank you for listening, and thank you for those who created this template for the presentation.